I used to tell myself it wasn't a big deal. That time would bury it, that distance would soften it, that maybe if I stopped talking about it, it would stop being real. But some truths don't die with silence. They just grow quieter until they live inside you in places even sleep cannot reach. I spent years pretending I forgot, but I didn't. I remembered it in the pauses between conversations, in the way certain words tightened my chest, in the way I avoided mirrors on some mornings. It wasn't the mistake itself that haunted me. It was the version of me who made it so sure, so stubborn, so afraid of looking weak. And I wonder now how different things might have been if I had just stopped just once and asked myself, what am I really afraid of? But I didn't. And life being life didn't wait for me to learn slowly. It taught me through loss, through distance, through the quiet erosion of something that once mattered. No one knew, not really. I was good at hiding it. I made people laugh. I worked hard. I showed up. But the silence inside me was louder than applause. And now, decades later, I sit with this memory not to punish myself, but to finally understand it. I used to think wisdom came from success, from getting things right, from becoming better than I was. But now I think real wisdom comes when we stop running from what we did wrong. When we look at the thing we've been too ashamed to face and say, yes, that was me and I'm still here. This isn't a story about shame. It's a story about what happens when you finally tell the truth to yourself. Not out loud, not to the world, just to the part of you that has waited quietly for permission to stop pretending. I don't know if this story will change anyone. It might not. But maybe it will do what the wind once did for me when I was younger. It will sit beside someone on a night when they need to feel less alone. Maybe it will say, you're not the only one who got it wrong. You're not the only one who waited too long to say sorry. You're not the only one who carries something unspoken. Maybe that's enough. Maybe this whisper is not an answer, but a beginning. When I look back, I realize it wasn't a single moment that changed everything. It was a slow build, a chain of small certainties that led me to one big, irreversible choice. And I thought I was right. Isn't that always the way it begins? We don't ruin things by being unsure. We ruin them by being too sure. At the time, I had just turned 50. It was the kind of age where you start to feel urgency, not just about career, but about meaning, legacy, respect. And I was tired of feeling like I was being overlooked, tired of explaining myself, tired of waiting for my turn. So when the opportunity came, I took it without hesitation, without pause, without asking the right questions. It was a business deal on paper, at least, but underneath it was something else. It was my chance to finally be in control, to prove to others, yes, but mostly to myself, that I was capable, that I had vision, that I didn't need anyone's permission to succeed. People close to me expressed doubt, not loudly, not rudely, but enough for me to hear. And I heard it, I just didn't listen. I remember one conversation in particular. She said, "Are you sure this is about the deal? Or is this about something you're trying to prove?" I smiled, brushed it off, told her I had it under control, that this was different, that I knew what I was doing. But the truth was, I didn't. What I had was ego disguised as confidence. What I lacked was humility. The numbers looked promising, the people involved sounded convincing, and I was so eager to move forward that I didn't look back. I signed papers I didn't fully read. I made promises I couldn't keep. I borrowed money I shouldn't have touched. And every time a small warning sign appeared, I called it fear, I called it hesitation, I called it weakness. Because admitting doubt felt like defeat. I thought being decisive meant being bold. Now I know sometimes it just means being blind. It didn't unravel overnight. That's the thing about slow disasters. You don't feel the ground crack until it's already too late. But the signs were there. The tone of calls changed. The energy in meetings shifted, the excitement turned to tension, and still I pressed on. Because turning back would have meant admitting I was wrong. And I wasn't ready for that. I still believed I could make it work. That one more call, one more deal, one more push, and I'd save it all. But what I didn't realize was that I wasn't just gambling money. I was gambling trust, time, relationships, health. And I was losing. The worst part, people still believed in me. They were still waiting for me to come through. They thought I had a plan, that I was being quiet because I was focused. But I was being quiet because I was afraid. Too far in to pull out, too proud to ask for help. So I lied, not in words, but in omission. I smiled while watching everything crack beneath me. I said I was fine while waking up at 3 doing math I knew wouldn't work. And I told myself I'd fix it before anyone had to know. But that's not how life works. Truth has a way of surfacing even when we bury it beneath layers of certainty. I didn't ruin my life in one big moment. I did it by convincing myself over and over that I was still in control. I thought I was making a bold decision. I was really making a desperate one. I thought I was leading. I was actually running. Away from fear, away from doubt, away from the part of me that whispered, "What if you're wrong?" I didn't listen. Crush anyone for us in this. And what came next was the beginning of a very slow, very painful lesson. A lesson I wouldn't be ready to learn for a very, very long time. At first, it looked like nothing. A delay in a payment, a missed call, a vague email. Small things that happen all the time in business. Things I told myself were normal. But they weren't. They were the beginning. It's funny how collapse never feels like collapse in the beginning. It feels like adjustment, like a bump, like something you can fix if you just stay focused. So I stayed focused. I adjusted, I recalculated, I sent the emails made, the calls kept the smile. But inside, a quiet panic had already begun. Still, I told myself, this happens. This is what real leaders deal with. What I didn't see or refused to see was that the foundation had already cracked. And I kept building on it. The payments stopped. The partners grew distant. Questions I used to get answers for started coming back with silence. I found myself working longer hours, not because there was more work, but because I was trying to hold the illusion together. Because if I slowed down even for a moment, I might have to admit I was losing control. And I couldn't afford that. Not after all the things I'd said, not after all the people I'd convinced. My reputation was built on certainty, on strength, on being the one who never flinched. So I didn't flinch even when everything around me started to. I remember the night it hit me, not fully but enough. I was lying in bed, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The numbers wouldn't add up. The calls weren't being returned, and I realized I didn't know how to stop what I had started. It was too big now, too many people involved, too many promises made. And yet I still told myself, maybe tomorrow something will shift. Maybe next week the money will clear. Maybe if I just keep pushing, I can outrun this. But the truth is I wasn't outrunning anything. I was sinking slowly, steadily, quietly. The collapse wasn't loud. It was quiet, like a tired sigh, like the sound of something giving way after carrying too much for too long. I stopped recognizing myself. I became short-tempered, paranoid, withdrawn. I stopped answering calls from people I cared about because I didn't know how to lie to them anymore, and I wasn't ready to tell the truth. I felt like I was carrying a secret so heavy it was pulling my entire life down with it. And still, I showed up, I wore the suit, I said the words, I played the part. But inside, everything was coming apart. The day the final contract fell through, the one that could have saved everything, I sat in my car for an hour, not moving, not thinking, just breathing, like someone had unplugged me from everything I believed I was. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I wanted to cry, but I couldn't. I just sat there trying to feel something, trying to figure out how I had ended up here so far from the man I thought I was. That was the moment I knew it wasn't just a business failing, it was a personal reckoning. I had built something on ego, and it had collapsed under the weight of silence. And worse, I had dragged people into it. People who trusted me, believed in me, followed me. And I had let them down without ever meaning to, without ever realizing how deep the fall would go. I started waking up feeling like an imposter, not because I failed, but because I pretended I wasn't. Because I kept wearing confidence like a mask that no longer fit. And behind that was someone small, afraid, and completely lost. The collapse I didn't see coming wasn't just financial. It was emotional, relational, existential. It was the undoing of a version of myself I had spent decades trying to build. And in that space, I had to face something I had spent my whole life avoiding. The truth. Not the dramatic kind, not the public confession. But the quiet truth, the one that whispered, "You're not who you thought you were." But maybe that's not the end of the story. The thing about falling is that you don't just hit the ground alone. You bring things down with you. People, relationships, moments that were never meant to break. I told myself I was protecting them, that if I kept the truth to myself, I could shield them from the worst of it. But silence is rarely protection. Most of the time, it's just distance dressed up as strength. The first person I hurt was the one who trusted me most. She didn't ask questions in the beginning. She believed in me, in my vision, in the version of me I worked so hard to present. She made space for my ambition. She held everything together while I tried to prove I could build something bigger than us. And then it all fell. I didn't tell her immediately I couldn't. How do you look someone in the eyes, someone who sacrificed their peace for your dream, and say it didn't work? I wasn't enough. I lost what we had. By the time I told her, I had already shut down, emotionally, mentally. I had rehearsed the words, but not the silence that followed. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just looked at me like she no longer recognized the person sitting in front of her. And maybe she didn't, because I wasn't that person anymore. Failure has a way of stripping you bare. It leaves only what's essential, what's true. And the truth was, I had hurt her. Not just by losing money, but by lying, by pretending, by building something fragile and asking her to believe it was made of steel. There were others too. Friends who offered advice I didn't take, who reached out when I started disappearing and got no answer. I used to be someone people called for help, guidance, support. And now I was the one hiding. And the longer I hid, the harder it became to come back. That's what failure does if you let it. It isolates you not because others leave, but because you convince yourself you no longer belong. I started turning down invitations, ignoring messages, pulling away from the people who had always shown up for me. And I told myself they were better off without me. I thought if I stayed silent long enough, the damage would fade. But time doesn't heal everything, especially the things we refuse to face. Some bridges burned slowly, others went up in a single moment. A conversation I mishandled, a response too cold, a silence too loud to ignore. And each one left a scar. Not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because I couldn't bear to be seen in the aftermath. I thought if they saw me, the broken me, the one without answers, they would turn away. But the truth is, they had already seen enough to know something was wrong. They were waiting not for perfection, but for honesty. And I couldn't give it to them. Not then. Mom. And that's the part that hurts most now. Not the money, not the reputation, not even the failure itself, but the time I lost by pretending I was okay. The birthdays I missed, the calls I didn't return, the chances I had to say I messed up, but I still want to be here. And now some of those chances are gone. Some doors don't open again. Some words don't reach the ears they were meant for. And while I've forgiven myself for making the wrong choice, I still grieve the people I lost along the way. Not because they left me, but because I left first. I left when I thought I was protecting them. And I see now how misguided that was. People don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be real. They don't need answers. They need presence. And when I disappeared under the weight of my own guilt, I didn't spare them pain. I just made it lonelier. There are conversations I wish I could have, again. Moments I wish I had stayed hands. I wish I had held instead of letting go, because I didn't know how to say, I need you now more than ever. But life doesn't rewind, it only teaches. And this was the lesson. You can repair a mistake, you can recover a loss, you can rebuild a career. But trust isn't rebuilt with time. It's rebuilt with presence, with truth, with showing up when you feel least worthy. And I didn't know that then. So I lost more than I had to, because I waited too long, to be honest. For a long time, silence felt like safety. It was the one thing I could control when everything else was falling apart. I didn't have to explain. Didn't have to lie, didn't have to hear my own voice, admit what I wasn't ready to face. So I stayed quiet. It began as a pause, a small space to breathe, to process, to gather myself. But it grew. From days to weeks to months. I stopped answering calls. I stopped returning messages. I even stopped talking to myself at night in those restless hours when the weight of it all pressed heavy on my chest. There is a difference between being alone and being silent. Alone can be peaceful, restorative. Silence, when born from shame, is something else entirely. It's a slow, fading, a quiet disappearance from the lives of people you once held close. And the thing about silence is that it feels easier until it doesn't. At first, it was a relief to not have to explain what went wrong, to not feel the judgment, the disappointment. But over time, the silence became a wall, and on the other side was everyone I had loved. I started rehearsing apologies in my head, conversations that never left the room where I whispered truths too late for anyone to hear. I told myself they wouldn't understand that too much time had passed, that if they wanted to reach out, they would have. But the truth was they had, and I had left them on the doorstep waiting while I locked myself inside. One night I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, not thinking, just sitting in the kind of silence that doesn't feel like rest, but regret. And I heard something, not out loud, not a voice, but something in me shifted. It said, "This is not who you are. You weren't made to disappear, to fade, to give up on the people who didn't give up on you." And for the first time in months, I cried. Not because I failed, not because I lost money, not even because I hurt people. I cried because I missed them. I missed being part of something, even if it was messy, even if it was uncertain. I missed being seen. And I knew then that silence had become a shield I was hiding behind. But no one could see me through it. If I wanted to come back, to reconnect, to repair, I had to speak again. Even if my voice shook, even if I didn't know what to say. Silence had protected me from shame, but it had also kept me from healing. It's easy to convince yourself that people don't care when you've gone quiet. It's harder to admit that you're the one who closed the door. I had to learn that forgiveness doesn't begin with someone else saying, "I forgive you." It begins when you're brave enough to say, "I was wrong," without knowing how it will be received. And that courage starts inside. In the silence you sit with when no one else is watching. That's what changed everything for me. Not a moment, not a dramatic turning point. Just the quiet and a decision to end it. To stop waiting for someone to reach into the silence and pull me out. And instead to reach out from within it and say, "I want to come back now if you'll still have me." Some did, some didn't. But that wasn't the point. The point was that I finally saw how the silence that once kept me safe was now keeping me separate. And I was ready to live with noise again. Even if it came with hard conversations, even if it meant confronting disappointment, even if I had to say "I'm sorry" more times than I could count. Because being silent may have protected me from judgment, but it also kept me from love. And I was tired of being safe but alone. For years, I thought the lesson would come in the form of a win. That if I just held on long enough, I'd turn the mistake into a comeback story. I'd fix what I broke, restore what I lost, and finally feel worthy again. But life had a different kind of wisdom to offer. Not the kind that wraps things up neatly. Not the kind that turns every failure into gold. This was a quieter wisdom, a harder one, but truer. The kind you don't learn until you've sat in silence, until you've looked at the people you've hurt and realized they owe you nothing, but still you choose to show up. The kind you don't earn but uncover when everything else has been stripped away. I used to think that admitting failure was weak, that to be respected you had to always be right, always in control, always sure. Now I know there's nothing more powerful than saying I was wrong and I'm still here. The lesson I learned wasn't about strategy. It wasn't about choosing better deals or working harder or trusting fewer people. It was about truth. That no version of success will ever feel safe if it's built on pretending. And no healing will ever last if it starts with denial. The moment things began to change wasn't when I made the money back or restored my reputation. It was the night I sat alone in a quiet kitchen and said out loud to no one I messed up, and I don't want to keep hiding. That was the turning point. Not because it fixed anything, but because it made space for something real to begin. I stopped trying to impress people who weren't in the room. I stopped trying to prove something to the version of myself that only existed in ambition. And I started very slowly, very awkwardly to become someone I could live with. Not someone perfect, but someone honest. Someone who could sit across the table from someone they hurt and say, "I'm not here to erase the past. I'm here to carry it with you, if you'll let me." That took time, more time than I like to admit. Because even when the lesson is clear, the ego is loud. Even when the past is over, the shame stays close. But little by little, I began to tell the truth more often, even when it was inconvenient, even when it made me look foolish. I started returning calls. I started showing up even when I didn't have anything to offer except presence. I stopped using silence as a way to protect myself and started using words as a way to connect again. And the people who stayed, they didn't stay because I redeemed myself. They stayed because I finally let them see me. Not the version I curated, but the version that needed them. That's the lesson that took me 30 years. That connection doesn't come from perfection, it comes from presence. That leadership isn't about never failing, it's about how you walk after you've fallen. That love doesn't require you to be right, only to be real. And that the scariest thing I ever did wasn't taking the risk that failed. It was standing in the rubble and choosing to build again. Not something bigger, not something better, just something true. There's a version of me who still wants to go back, still wants to rewrite the contract, reverse the decision, say the right thing before the silence began. But I can't. Fine. And I no longer believe that healing means undoing the past. It means holding it gently, truthfully, and letting it become something other people can rest against. A story, a scar, a lesson that maybe doesn't save them, but reminds them they're not alone. That's what I've learned. And I had to lose a lot to see it. I used to think time would solve it. That if I waited long enough, life would soften the edges of my mistake, that the people I hurt would forget, and the shame I carried would fade. But time doesn't heal what we don't face. It only gives space for the truth to grow louder in silence. The truth didn't arrive like a lightning strike. It came quietly through conversations I almost didn't have, through moments I almost walked away from. It came when I finally stopped asking, how do I fix what I broke, and started asking, how do I live honestly with what cannot be undone? For most of my life, I thought strength meant holding things together, being certain, leading without hesitation. But now strength looks different to me. It looks like sitting with the discomfort of your own choices without flinching. It looks like saying I'm sorry even when the outcome doesn't change. It looks like continuing to show up even when forgiveness isn't guaranteed. I used to want redemption, now I just want truth. To tell my story not as a warning, not as a performance, but as a human being who made a mistake and lived through it. That shift from proving something to simply being present has changed everything. I no longer look back to judge who I was. I look back to understand why I became him. And the more I understand, the softer I become with others, with myself. Because failure doesn't always come from doing the wrong thing. Sometimes it comes from wanting too much too fast, too alone. I've learned that it's not too late to grow. Even if the apology came years later, even if the relationship was never mended, even if the opportunity is gone. Growth still happens when truth is spoken, when presence is offered, when shame is replaced with honesty. The past still hurts some days more than others, but it no longer defines me. It shaped me, yes, but it didn't destroy me. And in that, there's a kind of quiet victory, not loud, not public, but deeply real. The kind that lets you rest at night without rehearsing what you should have said. The kind that lets you love people not because you're fixed, but because you've stopped pretending. I used to chase closure. Now I chase connection. And sometimes connection begins with nothing more than a whisper. I was wrong, I miss you, I'm trying to do better. That's what this season of life is teaching me. That healing isn't about going back, it's about going forward with clarity, with courage, with grace. And maybe with a little less noise in my own head. I don't know if I'll ever stop carrying what happened, but I know now how to carry it differently. Not like a burden, but like a teacher. Not to remind me of who I failed to be, but to ground me in who I've become. If I could speak to the version of me who stood so sure, so proud on the edge of that decision, I wouldn't try to stop him. I don't think he would have listened anyway, but I would stand beside him for just a moment and say, I see your hunger, I see your hope, I know how badly you want this to work. And then I'd whisper, but be careful what you silence to make it happen. Because that's what I did. I silenced the doubt, the questions, the people who loved me enough to speak honestly. And in that silence, I made the biggest mistake of my life. So this letter isn't a warning. You won't always know when something is a mistake. It won't feel like a wrong turn until years later, when you're sitting alone wondering when the distance began. This is not advice. I don't have advice anymore. I only have presence. So here it is. You can be wrong and still be worthy of love. You can mess up and still deserve to come home. You can lose something and still be someone. That took me a long time to learn. And longer to believe. The world doesn't need you to be perfect. People don't stay because you never fail. They stay because you're willing to be real, especially when it's hard. If you've made a mistake, I hope you'll stop running. I hope you'll stop waiting for the perfect words for the perfect time to make it right. Because waiting is where regret grows. And I promise you, saying I was wrong hurts far less than living with everything unsaid. It's not too late to tell the truth. It's not too late to show up, even if they don't take you back, even if nothing changes. You will have changed, and that matters. There's a version of you on the other side of this who sleeps better, who forgives deeper, who leads softer, who doesn't need to win to be okay. That version is waiting. And the only way to meet him is to stop pretending. So let go of the story. Let go of the shield. Let go of the shame that says you can't come back from this. You can nasurindo. And even if you can't undo what's been done, you can become someone who walks forward with truth in your hands and a little more grace in your voice. That's who I am now. Not because I figured it out, but because I stopped running. And if you're ready even just a little, you can stop too. I'll be right here waiting. Not with judgment, not with answers. Just with a chair pulled out and a quiet, welcome back.